So when you are in downtown Columbia, Tennessee, the first thing you probably notice is the big courthouse in the middle of the square. But right in front of the courthouse, there is a pretty big monument. It's called the Wall of Honor Monument, and it is to honor or remember military veterans from Maury County who died while on active duty during wartime. So anybody who served in a war and died during that war. So that could have been during battle, could have been from wounds sustained, could have been from sicknesses in camps. But going back all the way to the War of 1812 up through current conflicts, there's a list of names of veterans who died while in active duty military service during wartime. You can probably imagine that the majority of those names are Confederate soldiers. A lot of people from Maury County served in the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. But in 1998, when this monument was created, it did not include anybody from Maury County who served in the Union Army during the American Civil War. And there were actually quite a few people from Maury County who served in the Union Army. A lot of them were formerly enslaved African Americans who joined the Union Army as part of the United States Colored Troops or United States Colored Infantry and fought in the Civil War for their freedom. So in 2013, the African American Heritage Society of Maury County led a project to research USCT veterans from Maury County, find out who had died while in active duty military service, and have them added to the monument. So this is a lot of research, a lot of fundraising, a lot of going before the county commission to get permission for this project. In 2013, they were finally able to add that first list of USCT members to the monument. So now we have a Wall of Honor monument in Maury County that honors not only Confederate soldiers who died while in active military service, but also federal soldiers who died while in active duty military service. Now, when I was growing up in school, I don't remember learning a lot about the USCT. So I was really interested to learn more. And what's really great is that since 2013, there's been a lot more research done on USCT members and their experiences throughout Middle Tennessee. So what we're going to do over the next couple episodes is we're going to go up to Franklin and talk to my friend, local historian Tina Jones, about USCT members in Williamson County. And then we're going to go up to Fort Negley and learn about what USCT members experienced there in Nashville during the Civil War. Hey everybody, I'm here at Toussaint L'Ouverture Cemetery in downtown Franklin. You might be wondering what I'm doing at a cemetery. You can actually learn a lot about local history from your town's historic cemeteries. Looking around, you can get a lot of information from the headstones that you could take and actually research and find out who's buried in that cemetery and what their life was like. One thing that I've noticed around this cemetery in particular is that there's a lot of headstones of veterans. Today we're going to meet up with my friend Tina Jones, and we're going to talk about a very particular group of these veterans called the United States Colored Troops.
So the United States Colored Troops was a part of the federal forces during the Civil War. They were created after the authority of the Emancipation Proclamation said that black men could serve in the Army and the Navy. And it's kind of a lesser known story of Middle Tennessee that Tennessee sent the third largest number of any state in the country to serve in the U.S. Colored Troops. These were former slaves, almost exclusively, a few free men of color, and about 20,000 men from Tennessee served. And they would have been infantry, artillery, like with the cannons, and cavalry. And the black men at that time were only allowed to serve as enlisted men. So they were primarily privates and corporals and sergeants, and then they all had white officers.
Okay. Well, how many men who served in the United States colored troops are buried here in this cemetery?
Okay, so that's a great question. So we know that there's 3 buried here, and I actually got interested in researching them when I realized that so many men from Tennessee and from Middle Tennessee had served, but we only knew of 3. So there are 3 men. They all served in infantry units. There was Freeman Thomas, John Dubison, and Peter Radcliffe.
Okay. Now, we should note this cemetery is a black cemetery. Is that correct?
That's right.
So there is a white cemetery
right there through the pine trees.
Right behind us. So everybody buried here, all the veterans that we see here in these headstones, I've seen World War I, World War II, and of course the 3 U.S. colored troops. These are all African Americans who served in the military.
That's right. So a lot of people buried here don't even have headstones, so you can't visualize how many people are buried here. But there were many people buried here who had been slaves in Williamson County and then died and are buried here. And then we also have, like you said, Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, Korea, World War II, Vietnam. I mean, there's somebody here from every conflict.
Okay. Well, let's go check out one of these headstones. So one thing I just wanted to point out before we started talking about the gentleman who's buried here is if you're walking through a cemetery, if you're interested in learning more about the people who are buried there, look for the flags. Typically, a little flag like this would signify that this is a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces. But we're here at the burial site of Freeman Thomas. And can you tell us a little bit about him?
Sure, I would love to. He is actually my favorite story to tell because he was one of the first soldiers that I really identified and was able to put his story together. So he was born here in Williamson County. He was enslaved on a plantation in the Cool Springs area by the Carruthers family. And actually, he initially went by the name Freeman Carruthers. He used their last name, but his father had been owned by the Thomas family, and so his father's last name was Thomas. And I think that after the war, when he was able to sort of step into his freedom a little bit more and claim who he really wanted to be, he changed his last name from Freeman Carruthers to Freeman Thomas. Another reason I think his story is so interesting is that he was interviewed by Fisk sociology professors in the 1920s. He would have been an old man by then. He was born in the 1840s. And so he gave this incredible description of his life here as an enslaved teenager. And through his interview, we know a lot about what it was like to be a slave in Williamson County. He talked about what they ate, how they were treated, how they dated. I mean, everything. So Freeman's really was a wealth of information. But he joined the United States colored troops. One day, he and a group of black men were working in a field shucking corn on today's Murfreesboro Road, headed towards I-65, and they heard a band playing, and it was a U.S. military band. And he says, we broke and ran. We dropped everything and we ran over to them, and they said, we want to join your army. And they were sent to Fort Granger here in Franklin to work. And then soon after that, they were sent to Nashville to work at Fort Negley. After a few months at Fort Negley, they were enlisted into the 12th United States Colored Infantry. You could see on his headstone, it says 12 U.S. Colored Infantry, sort of hyphenated, and he served in Company K. There were at least 50 other men from Williamson County who enlisted on the same day that he did in August of 1863 at Fort Negley into Company K, just
Wow.
into that one company, which is usually about 100 men. So about at least half of that company were Williamson Countyans, which is kind of incredible.
Yeah.
He was then sent to a training camp in Tullahoma, and he says in his interview that that was the biggest thing that had ever happened to him. He felt like a man with a gun and a uniform, and he was evidently very proud for the rest of his life of his uniform. I have here, this is a buckle, it says U.S. This is what all the United States colored troop and regular soldiers, white and black, would have worn that were defending the Union. And so he served for a few years in the Army. He worked on the railroads. They would have driven these metal spikes into the ground as they were laying the tracks. And then the 12th United States Colored Infantry, along with thousands and thousands of other men and many more regiments, fought at the Battle of Nashville. He was shot in the leg at John Overton's house, which you might know is the Travelers Rest historic site today.
Yeah.
He was in the woodlot fighting, climbing up what's called Peach Orchard Hill, attacking a Confederate sort of stronghold, and he was shot. And following the Battle of Nashville, U.S. colored troops came back through Franklin, but he was allowed to recuperate in Nashville, and he was granted a furlough, which meant kind of like a pass to come back to Franklin and visit his family. And when I tell people that, they're sometimes surprised because they think, why would a slave want to go back to visit the place where they were enslaved? But that was still his home. He probably still had family there and friends. And he confronted the wife of the man who had owned him, and she said to him, "Why are you fighting me? Don't you remember you were little and I took care of you?" And he said, "I'm not fighting you, I'm fighting to be free." And he would have been wearing that blue uniform with his U.S. buckle. And so it's a pretty remarkable story. He ended up settling in Franklin. He built a house on Franklin Road that still stands right across from the factory.
Okay.
And then he built another house in downtown Franklin where the brownstones are, in a historically African-American neighborhood that's no longer there. He lived to be 91. He died on his birthday. Oh. And the obituary that I found for him said that his pallbearers were veterans of World War I and the Spanish-American War. And so those are probably men who are also buried here in the cemetery, which is kind of remarkable.
Yeah. Well, that's an incredible story. You mentioned Fort Granger when we were talking. I thought we might head up there.
That'd be great.
And talk more about what members of the U.S. colored troops and U.S. colored infantry from Williamson County experienced here.
Great.
All right, so we are here above downtown Franklin at Fort Granger. Now, Fort Granger is a place where many of these formerly enslaved men who joined the United States Army effort would have come as their first stop, right?
That's right. So we know that in 1863, the Army was impressing large numbers, and even in 1862, they were impressing large numbers of black men, women, and even children to build forts.
When you say impress.
Okay. What does that mean?
Yes.
So it's not slavery, but it's basically saying you must come with us and work for us. And they were supposed to be paid. A lot of them were not. The record keeping wasn't good. It seems as though there wasn't a ton of incentive to have to pay them. But we know that hundreds of black men, women, and children from Williamson County would have helped to build Fort Negley in Nashville. And we know that some of them also were here. So when we were at Toussaint Louverture, we talked about the 3 U.S. colored troop headstones that are there. One of them was a man named Peter Radcliffe. We know that he was impressed and worked here to help build Fort Granger. And then a group of men were taken from Fort Granger down to Columbia, Tennessee, and Maury County, and they enlisted in the 15th United States Colored Infantry. And there was something like 24 who were men had been born in Williamson County, helped build this fort, work at this fort, and then enlisted down in Columbia. And then Freeman Thomas, who we talked about, we know that he was also here. So there's not good records, but we know that they were a significant part. Women would have been washing clothes, doing cooking. Children would have been foraging and gathering firewood, things like that.
Okay. So when we were talking about Freeman Thomas, you mentioned that in his interview with Fisk, he talked about joining the United States Army basically from the field where he was working. Was that common, or would there have been a place where people would go?
So that's a great question. So when the United States Colored Troops was formed, they set up an office in Nashville. Nashville was one of the hubs for this activity, and then they set up recruiting stations. So there was not a recruiting station here in Franklin, but we know that recruiters came here. So they were both U.S. Army recruiters who would go out with, often with some men that they'd already recruited in their uniforms to be like, look how good these guys look, and they're getting paid. And, these men had never been paid a day for their work before. So they would take them out, and sometimes recruiters, often from the North, often abolitionists, had come here specifically to help recruit black men. And they would go from plantation to plantation, or to small farms or factories and looking for men who would be interested in enlisting.
Yeah. I mean, that seems like a risky choice to make. Although I guess it kind of feels like maybe you're between a rock and a hard place if you're enslaved and then joining the military.
Right. I think that's exactly it. I think that a lot of them, maybe it wasn't that much of a choice. Maybe they were sort of scooped up and sent to these places like Peter Radcliffe, who was here and then sent to Columbia. But others like Freeman Thomas are very clear that he was fighting to be free, and he understood what it meant. And when you read some of the memoirs of their white officers who talk about the process of recruiting them and enlisting them, they often did ask them about their motivation, because they wanted men who wanted to fight, that weren't just impressed or there because it was the best of the worst options.
So one thing that I think is really interesting about talking about the United States colored troops is just the concept of emancipation. I think in school we tend to learn, you know, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved people were free, and that's kind of the end of it. But really, the story is much more complicated, and I think you get a really good appreciation for that when you're learning what happened in your community. So Tennessee was not covered by the Emancipation Proclamation, right?
The freedom parts, the freedom provisions were not. Tennessee was excluded.
And so why was Tennessee excluded?
So Tennessee was excluded because it was considered no longer in rebellion. So Tennessee was really only sort of officially, it was part of the Confederacy, but Nashville, the capital, fell within 6-7 months of its declaration of leaving, of its secession. And federal troops had come to this area pretty quickly. They were here by February of 1862. And so Abraham Lincoln didn't want to rock the boat and risk losing the support of Unionists who maybe still owned slaves here. So he excluded any areas that were no longer in rebellion.
So instead of, in Tennessee, enslaved people becoming free with the Emancipation Proclamation, this is actually a very active process. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of United States or Union forces in Middle Tennessee, in Franklin, in Maury County even, and a lot of enslaved people who were living here at the time, which was a big portion of the population, right?
Yes. So soon after Tennessee secedes, you start seeing runaway ads looking for these enslaved people. It goes from maybe 3 or 4 a day in a newspaper to just columns of them. And so you can tell that they're emancipating themselves. They are self-emancipating and saying, I'm going to take this opportunity to sort of fissure in this institution of slavery to make my escape. And then just like you said, the emancipation was a very personal decision.
I think people don't always understand just kind of how chaotic the Civil War was, especially in Middle Tennessee, because you had so many troop movements coming and going, and then you have the Union occupation of most of the area for most of the war, and it did kind of create this situation where enslaved people could take that opportunity to flee, run to the Union lines, and ask for safety, ask for freedom, join the military. A lot of people in kind of a laboring capacity, but then for men especially, that often turned into actual military service.
Yeah, it was really a refugee crisis in a lot of ways. There were just thousands of people looking to leave, and the military ended up providing almost a social service organization for some of them. And then there were people from organizations from the North who came down to help too.
And, we certainly don't want to paint the picture that there was any kind of even guaranteed safety in the Union line.
No, right.
It
was still very dangerous. The federal government was not living up to its obligations. It wasn't paying these men who were working here at Fort Granger. Like we know Peter Radcliffe, who's one of the men who's buried at Toussaint Louverture, he helped build this fort. There was actually a Senate inquiry into the treatment of these laborers, and his company is pointed out as one example of men who were told they worked here 9 months. They were supposed to be paid $10 a month, and they only got paid for like 1 month of all that time. And during that time, we know that he had a wife and a young daughter, and they probably needed the money. They needed him, but he was here. So they were on their own.
It's so interesting. And this is, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Franklin. I've not spent a lot of time up here.
Yes, I know. I feel like it's sort of, for as much as Franklin and Williamson County embraces its Civil War history and loves its history, Franklin is sort of, I mean, the Fort Granger is really sort of the untold story of that. And I'm so grateful to the city of Franklin for preserving it and keeping it for generations to tell this story.
I had a great time up in Franklin today talking with my friend Tina Jones about her research into USCT veterans in Williamson County. And we're going to put up the address to her blog so that if you're interested, you can read more about her research. Join us next time. We're going to be headed up to Fort Negley to talk with Krista Castillo about what African American Civil War soldiers experienced in Nashville and at Fort Negley during the Civil War.